Today, we will be speaking with Geoff Gates, Senior Director of Supply Chain Support Services, P2P, and Technology at the Cleveland Clinic, and Matt Rechin, Chief Commercial Officer at ReadySet. We're going to be having a conversation today on how to align clinical, operational, and vendor partners to build best practices to just really identify those efficiencies and start moving towards a strategic approach that is, not only something that you achieve, but it's something you sustain and you continue to build on that. And what's going to be great is the clinic has a unique approach to that. They have a great relationship with the ReadySet team. And I think this is going to be a nice use case for how providers and suppliers alike can work together to really achieve, some goals that can be transformational for the organization. So stay with us. We're going to be right back with Geoff and Matt after a short break. I have the pleasure of speaking now with Geoff Gates, Senior Director of Supply Chain Support Services, P2P, and Technology at Cleveland Clinic, as well as Matthew Rechin, Chief Commercial Officer at ReadySet. And we're going to be talking about how to build best practices for clinical, operational, and vendor alignment. All three parties have to work in synergy to deliver quality care, but do it efficiently, especially in these times of, I'd say, really enormous financial pressures on healthcare. So, Geoff, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
And Matt, it's great to connect with you again as well. So really happy to have you on. And I like getting everybody together to have this roundtable conversation. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Super excited about today's topic.
So, Geoff, maybe just to kick us off, tell us a little bit about your role at the clinic.
Sure. So I've been with the Cleveland Clinic for about 8 years now. And so in my role as the lead over P2P and tech, I have a few different things that my team's responsible for. So I have data, I have analytics, purchasing, technology, anything that we're doing in AI and automation, and then resiliency as well are all kind of within my scope. What is maybe a little bit unique about our team is that with supply chain and support services, that encompasses your more traditional supply chain activities like vendor management, materials management, and purchasing, but it also includes food service, laundry and linen, and sterile processing. And so all of that is kind of under one umbrella, and we take the same approach to people, process, technology, and data across all of those teams.
You don't always hear about sterile processing falling into that structure, or sometimes they're bouncing back and forth between supply chain and the operating room. How recent is that development for you all to pull sterile processing into the conversation or into the structure?
So really over the last year and a half. And so it historically has been part of surgical operations and then recently made that transition and kind of fit under the supply chain umbrella. I think we've seen a lot of really good synergies from some of the tools that we do use, but even just overlap on things like procurement and, how are we buying instruments versus implants and other commodity type goods. We've really seen a lot of overlap, and it's been good to have that part of the team, particularly as we look at, what does our perioperative strategy look like in the future?
Yeah, I think even for this conversation today, really just looking at how you work with vendors. I mean, so many of them come in directly into the sterile processing environment, and we know they do into the operating room as well. And, really all departments throughout the hospital. But there's something kind of unique about how loaner and consignment trays come into the sterile processing department that I think really fits well being underneath supply chain operations.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, if we think about a part of our larger vendor management program, I mean, there's a lot of interactions that occur in that space alone. I think it's giving better access to, in some cases, for things that can be a pain point. If we think about the turnaround time needed to process loaner trays, making sure that, things are coming in and leaving appropriately, having that kind of conduit into, how we do vendor management, I think has helped the larger team.
Well, I think it really tees up the conversation today. And Matt, feel free to chime in on this, but just to really achieve the kinds of efficiencies that healthcare organizations need today, we really need to, as we talked about at the beginning, pull in clinical, pull in supply chain, but we also have to have strong relationships with our supplier partners and really integrate them into how we build the efficiencies. And a lot of that can be just removing manual effort, tech enablement. But Matt, I don't know if you want to kind of echo some of that in terms of what you do at ReadySet and how you have kind of a laser focus on helping facilitate that.
Yeah, it's actually a great segue for what we are doing here at ReadySet, and proud to say we're able to do it with our great partners at the Cleveland Clinic. But Geoff mentioned earlier, people, process, technology, and data. Oftentimes we have seen where customers or hospitals focus so much on the technology, and maybe they have forgotten to look at how the interaction will be with the vendors and how that actually gets activated with the vendors. So if you aren't integrating the vendors into all of those processes and workflows that you're trying to improve, all you've really done is added technology to a broken process, and it's not going to get you the results you hope to achieve.
And then connecting to the data, at least you'll have line of sight to where it's broken, right? And
absolutely.
The whole conversation today, I think we've done a nice job of, painting the landscape a little bit, but we want to focus in on best practices and talking about that, but talking about it in this more aligned way from all three different stakeholders that are involved that we just talked about. And I think we probably should start by defining what best practice means across all stakeholders. And, Geoff, that might mean something different to the clinic than it does to other organizations, but I'd love to hear it in your words.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we've done, particularly within that space that, I think we would define as some of our best practices. I mean, one, it is strong clinical engagement, right? And so we have historically had medical directors in all of our areas to support large initiatives or even just day-to-day operations, right? If I think about some of our inventory transformation efforts early on, when we first started to move into the perioperative space, I remember being at one of the facilities that I was at the time. And, the project was presented by one of the medical directors who was a physician who worked there. It carries a lot more weight coming from them than it does from, the supply chain person. And so, we've definitely, leveraged them in that capacity. When it comes to those conversations with suppliers and vendors, it's kind of that same approach, right? They're helping to drive the consistency in the message because ultimately their voice is the one that carries the most weight, I think, in a lot of these conversations. And so, making sure that you have that strong partnership clinically, it goes a long way in getting buy-in on your initiatives and being able to remove roadblocks or get to a level of consistency. It all starts with that engagement with your clinical teams.
I'd love for you to talk about what it looks like with vendor relationships too. Like, what are those best practices? Because, you get a lot of different training depending on, as a vendor, who you work for. And so, not everybody has the same idea of what best practices are. And what they do at the clinic might be different than another organization that the vendor goes to, in the same market, and they might have different expectations. So how do you help them align, or what would be a best practice in helping make sure there's, visibility and maybe alignment to each individual healthcare organization's best practices?
Yeah, sure. I think, it starts with kind of just the universal acceptance of vendors want to do a great job. They are driven by how can we better support the clinical team at the Cleveland Clinic or wherever it may be. And in doing so, they obviously have all kinds of demands on their time and what their daily workflows is and all those types of things. We've found at ReadySet that we try and engage with vendors well in advance of any new technology update, things of that nature, and then be able to kind of visually and measurably show them the impact it's going to have on their day-to-day workflow. And, in doing so, make their lives a little bit easier. Without that, vendors are getting bombarded with requests to, hey, we've got another in-service coming. We'd love you guys to get more training. We're going to provide a podcast for you to have more training and those types of things. vendors, I think, typically want to find things that are really going to have a measurable impact on their day and help them provide better service. And the further in advance of those types of introduction of technologies and things like that, typically the more impact you're going to be able to create, and the compliance is going to be significantly greater.
I feel like we talk a lot more about value-based purchasing, with that kind of coming into play. And Geoff, you talked about clinical engagement, which is kind of the purpose of having, value analysis as a function of supply chain. But I think a lot of it too is people have looked at value differently, and they've taken price down a notch. And in some cases, maybe it's down several notches in terms of like how it plays into decision making. I think staying locked on in terms of focus around patient safety is what we're hearing in that, model of value analysis and looking at these relationships. But Geoff, how have you seen that change the game, I guess, in terms of not only how you've structured things at the Cleveland Clinic, but also how you look at initiatives strategically?
Yeah, there's probably, there's different ways to slice it based on what you're trying to get at. But, if you think about product selection, right, it's not necessarily always the lowest cost, right? We do pay very close attention to expected outcomes, efficacy of the product. What are some of the challenges that may go with that? And obviously price is still a component of that. But, even when we went through a recent effort here, our operations team focused on updating procedure cards across the enterprise, right? And where you get a group of physicians together to talk about the items that are used in a procedure, it was about outcomes. It was about what was best for the patient. It wasn't about reducing the overall cost of the card. Now, some of that happens organically, but it was really focused on what the outcome was and what is right for the patient. When you start to translate that in some cases to value, there's other things that a supplier can do to help deliver that value. We have had a lot of conversations operationally with some of our key partners and key suppliers around, how do we deliver more efficiently? How do we reduce touches in the workflows, right? If we think about the process of, taking product from the dock into the OR or bringing it into sterile processing, like any touch is just, it's added cost, it's added time. And we've had suppliers that have come to us with solutions that have said, well, if we made this one change, we're going to reduce freight costs, or maybe we can do direct delivery to the OR versus it, having to be brought in from receiving into a storeroom and then into the OR, right? And so when you start to expand those conversations, there's different things that can ultimately help deliver value. You need to be open to looking at those solutions and then working through what needs to happen in order to enable them.
Matt, you're a supplier, but you sit in between suppliers and healthcare providers, right? So I'm sort of interested, how has approaches like that shaped how you even have conversations with your customer base or people that are looking to evaluate your technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, Cleveland Clinic as a kind of strategic partner, I think we would both agree. I'm not trying to put words into Geoff's mouth. I know he likes when I do that, but I think we have a lot of great alignment around what our vision is of what it is that we're trying to accomplish, what type of efficiencies are we trying to create. But going back to Geoff's earlier statement, is it absolutely all starts with patient care. What ReadySet has done is we've kind of looked at identifying what are those manual tasks, kind of low quality, low value add tasks that are taking both vendors and the caregiver away from providing the very best care for their patient or for the healthcare provider. Vendors, they have a lot of their own proprietary systems that they use to give them greater information, greater visibility into what they need to get accomplished with the given provider. So it wouldn't make any sense, as an example, for ReadySet to just pile another piece of technology on top of that without being able to integrate or exchange data with whatever those proprietary systems may be. In doing so, then you really are lightening the burden off of them from that manual workload or those low quality tasks. And in doing so, hopefully lowering costs, but freeing up time that they can provide better service, better product, better technology, all those types of things as well. But without keeping patient care as your primary focus, everything else kind of doesn't matter. So that's where we start.
And I mean, and I would add on to that, because I mean, things that, we've looked at, right, is just if we think about rep communication, just as the example, right? Email, text message, phone calls, right? There's huge opportunities to streamline that. And I think we've made some efforts, here over the last year or so to really kind of have the one portal to do that. There's more that we could do with that too, right? I know that we've talked about what else is it that we could share. How do we streamline updates or changes and let the reps actually be more predictive and not wait until they show up to know what's actually needed? But you need the technology to enable a lot of that.
I feel like there's an intangible in this conversation that maybe we just need to call out, because you don't know necessarily when you start working with a new vendor or a new supplier organization, what you can expect from them. But, Geoff, obviously it's not just like a simple kind of, it's not all covered in an RFP, right? You can't just put it in a spreadsheet and know that it's going to help you get exactly what you want out of that relationship, right? There's another element to how you work at a deeper level strategically. And, I'm sure trust is a big part of that, but how do you evaluate that? And how do you establish that over time?
Yeah, I mean, you use the word trust. I mean, I think that's a big piece of it. And I mean, I think that, it's probably hard to put in paper and in words everything that goes into that. But, you need to look at some of those intangibles, right? Are you willing to innovate is, I think, a perfect example. Our culture really is around innovation and doing what we think is the kind of leading edge stuff within health systems. And so, we look for partners that are going to be doing that too, right? And, when we come up with a crazy idea, someone's going to say, well, yeah, I know how we can do that. No, that's not possible, right? It's those are kind of the intangible things that we really look for when it comes to, who we want to work with in some of these spaces.
Matt, from your perspective, having worked with the clinic, what are those conversations like when you come together and you start looking at the data and you're being transparent and you're trying to have the kind of conversation that removes inefficiencies and you're exploring that? Like, how is that different than maybe a standard kind of customer supplier relationship that you've been part of, conversationally in the past? Are you all kind of digging through every available piece of information to find, where the improvements lie?
Great question. I think if you were to speak to any ReadySet client, the Cleveland Clinic being one, anyone else out there, one of the first things they would likely say that they found separates ReadySet from a lot of others out there is just kind of the robustness of the data and the analytics that we provide that is actually really actionable. There's no doubt there's this sea of sameness out there today. Everyone knows the difficult economic climate that many hospitals are facing. And so everyone is shouting, hey, we're going to help you lower costs. We can do this, lower costs. I can't imagine how many emails Geoff gets every day from someone else promising that they're going to reduce costs. What's really cool is that vendors understand that exceptionally well. And Geoff just mentioned it. They've got clients that come to them with ideas that are way more strategic than just, we're just going to reduce your prices. Hey, these are ways we can reduce costs. In ReadySet's own perspective and our view of the world, we can go back to any client at any given time, a push of a button, and show them to the minute, here's exactly what cost reductions our technology has been able to provide. Here's what improvements we've been able to provide. Here's cost avoidance we've been able to provide. But it all ends up in a bucket, whether it be hard dollar return or cost avoidance. And clients want that kind of integrity or that commitment that's what you're going to be delivering to them. All of those other things, being able to streamline vendor communications, being able to make sure that loaner trays are getting delivered on time and checked out on time. Those absolutely, if you're not doing those things, nothing else really matters. Those are kind of fundamental. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to measure yourself on what did you actually accomplish. And in our world, doing things like being able to call out exactly what cost reductions the software has been able to provide is where a lot of that conversation begins.
Geoff, I'm interested in getting your thoughts on, you used a term, Matt, soft savings. And I feel like sometimes if you provide a service, whether it's technology or maybe it's, a service that you have a team of FTEs that's delivering in the hospital that's outsourced. Sometimes, and I've run this before because I've run some sales and operations for an instrument repair company in the past. And there are like some real obvious efficiencies, but to quantify the return on investment is elusive. But inherently, we know that it will have a profound impact on, the health systems teams doing things, provide more value back to their organization. Geoff, how do you look at that? Or do you just kind of say like, yeah, we need to get the ROI, but we inherently build some of those soft savings efficiencies on top of it and make it more of a operational KPI? How do you approach that?
Well, so when we look at a new solution, like we do have to demonstrate the hard ROI. We have a pretty robust process about it. And sadly, cost avoidance is not one of the things that is considered the hard ROI. So, we look at the process, we look at where those opportunities are, we get the feedback. Sometimes it's a little painful on the front end because, maybe it's looking at a process or trying to get data around something that we've never done before. But we really work to come up with, what do we think those savings opportunities will be that will translate to, hard savings off the P&L. When it comes to then I'll say the softer savings, things like cost avoidance or time saved, we do keep track of that. And then it becomes a matter of saying, well, what am I translating that to? Right. So one of the goals that my team actually has this year is just how much time did we optimize through automation this year? And then there's actual savings that comes from that time that we've optimized. So if a sourcing person, we free up hours, is that another contract that they can go work on? If it's materials, right? Are they able to go look at inventory differently now? And maybe we're reducing par levels or redeploying inventory. And so we do kind of look through to say, what are the opportunities that those teams could work on now if we've given them back the time to do so? And so that we kind of approach it from both standpoints then.
Yeah, I do feel like there's a way to calculate soft savings when you're freeing up time. And to your point, your rate of adoption, for new opportunities goes up when people can just naturally do more volume. And you talked about reducing manual effort and bringing in automation. It's such an obvious opportunity right now. And so many different ways to do it internally and with external partnerships as well. Another thing I kind of wonder around the soft savings topic is, are you focused on at least monitoring efforts that reduce variability and like the margin for error when it comes to human effort?
We do that, and that comes into that time saved slightly. I mean, and we do a lot more variation analysis than we used to, particularly around something like the procedure cards is probably the best example, right? So what's the variation across the board on the procedure, and what's the impact now of having to stock an additional product or 5 additional products or whatever it is. And so we're getting more into that. Have we figured out exactly how to translate variation into the soft savings? Probably not yet, but we've started to expose where those opportunities exist.
I'd like to talk, just as we're kind of wrapping this up, around not only getting the alignment, and we kind of touched on some of the things that are like more obvious and concrete, and other elements to the discussion that are, a little bit harder to document. But at the end of the day, I think, how do you sustain this alignment? And then how do you measure its improvement over time? So let's focus on some of the things we just talked about that you can measure as we talk through that. But how do you do that? Because I think traditionally what I had seen is you bring in a new vendor, you bring in a product, you go through implementation, everybody's paying attention, right? Everybody's bought in. We're going to get this thing over the line. We're going to learn how to use the technology or work with a new team that's delivering the service, and make sure it's working just perfectly. But then it always feels like things kind of fall off a little bit from that initial standard that gets set. So how do we sustain it, and how do we measure that not only are we sustaining it, but we're improving upon it? Either one of you can take this one.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I mean, when it comes to, new solutions and when we've deployed anything, I don't think we've had anything that has really kind of fallen to the wayside and is like out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, we're always looking at, how do we improve on something, whether it's the efficiencies that we can gain, whether it's the data that we're looking at. And so like internally, we're always looking at those opportunities, right? I have folks on my team that meet with all of our end users and business departments within supply chain and support services to get that feedback, work on how viable a solution is. And then they go work with partners on implementing it, right? Whether it's changing a workflow in an application or, developing something ourselves, we're constantly doing that. And so as a byproduct, like we're meeting all the time with our suppliers, right? We're having, it's beyond just a QBR, right? Because the QBR it's not really just an update of kind of what we've done. It's more of, are we aligned on where we're going over the next 3-6 months to a year? Because we're already having the day-to-day conversations and resolving those things as they come up. Like that's not what we're focused on in a QBR. But I think it's having the teams internally to just be constantly focused on what's next and how do we get better, that kind of leads to having those conversations all the time.
And your strategic initiatives change too, right? So just because you brought something in 3 years ago with, goals that aligned with what you were doing organizationally, like you may be pivoting or you may be adjusting a little bit. So bringing everybody back in to talk about that shift as well is important.
No, and that's where those checkpoints to just say, like, are we on the right strategic path? Like, that's where those become important because we absolutely experience it where priorities shift. There's new initiatives. There's things that change. And, it's partially it's us being agile, but we need partners to do the same thing.
Yeah, if I can, I'm just going to add to that, Justin, all of those types of scenarios or outcomes that you were just describing, it all kind of starts with a pretty fundamental expectation that the product or the technology is going to do what you said it was going to do. There's probably not, Geoff, I'm sure can share, I can't imagine that there's a supply chain leader out there that hasn't been burned, for lack of a better word, on some type of technology or product that they committed to or purchased that didn't quite perform the way they thought it was going to, wasn't able to integrate with the system they thought it was going to be able to integrate with. So in spite of all the things that you're doing during training and how great you say the product is going to be able to work, the moment that training ends and the product is available, the technology is available, it all starts with an expectation of this thing's going to do everything that you guys told me it was going to do, right? And those times when it doesn't, those get a pretty bright light shined on them pretty quickly. And you have to figure out, for in the best interest of the provider and the patient and the vendor, how are we going to kind of resolve this issue? But, I think specifically in ReadySet's world, I'm super proud to say when we finish an implementation and we finish training, I think everyone would say, this product does everything that we thought it was going to do, and it's pretty easy to use. And then they'll start seeing almost immediate impact over a number of different metrics.
So, Matt, something you told me, and I've always been a firm believer in the QBR, and part of it goes back to the fact that I was a regional leader in a service business. And so I feel like, constantly realigning on how it's going. You've got people deployed on site, but I've always been a big believer in doing that. And I am shocked actually at how many organizations don't execute proactively on that. But even you kind of raised the bar for me in a conversation recently where you said, yeah, we don't call them QBRs because when you say QBR, a lot of the suppliers feel like, oh, this mundane thing where we put up the same, reports that we put up the last time and just prove that our technology or our product or whatever is doing what we said it would do. But you approach it differently. So I'd love for you to share that with the audience.
Yeah, I think QBR, it's certainly not a bad name or anything like that, but it is kind of this widely accepted terminology that's used that says, okay, now we're going to come out, we're going to say what we did, we're going to say what we didn't do, and then we're going to say what we're going to do over the next 90 days. And if you kind of get caught into that rut, so to speak, pretty soon you just become like we're just providing this stream of consciousness without any real strategic alignment going on. So one of the other great things about working with the folks at Cleveland Clinic is we do have those in-depth decisions. And, you know, the other thing I would add is if you're walking into those meetings and you're going to be reporting on something that they don't know, or you're going to be, oh, well, isn't this really great? Look what we did for you. And they don't already know it. You've kind of failed somewhere along the way that it isn't readily apparent of impact, savings, time impact, whatever it may be. So that in doing that, that allows us then to spend super valuable time, not even so much on our part, but on time of like folks at the clinic. Those folks have a ton on their plate. I want them to be able to walk out of that meeting saying, that was a great 90-minute discussion. I know exactly what those guys are working on. I know it's in line with what we're trying to do. And I know at the end of it all, they're going to do what they said. So that's why we try to stay out of, quote unquote, the QBR discussion, but that's kind of the thinking behind it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. It's, you know, because it's the time of year, right? Everyone's probably doing annual performance reviews, right? If you walk into that conversation surprised, it's a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Probably what I would say.
I actually was thinking the exact same thing, Geoff. I was like, you're right. If you're communicating well with your team, anything that's discussed in the annual review should not be a shock to them. Gentlemen, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to kind of give each of you an opportunity to say some final thoughts, but I appreciate you coming on. And I thought this was a great conversation today. So Geoff, maybe start with you, any kind of final thoughts, and thank you again for coming on.
No, I mean, just to emphasize, I mean, I think when we look at, the supplier relationships, I mean, it's a key part of what we do every day, right? We can't do what we do without suppliers, and we need to make sure that we're streamlining how we're doing things with them, what we're doing, and ultimately how do we deliver that value together? It's really a key component of what we need to do really every day.
And Matt, how about you? Anything we didn't cover in the discussion that we should emphasize before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a great discussion. Thanks for your time. And obviously, Geoff, thank you for the time. But I go back to something that Geoff said earlier. I love it. And we use it here all the time. But best practices, you cannot be best at anything if you don't start with people, process, technology, and data, because all four need to be addressed in order to even begin a conversation of best practices. So at ReadySet, I think one of the things that really sets us apart from others is that when you evaluate our technology, it begins with looking at that through those four kind of prisms, which we believe leads you to continuous improvement. So when I think of best practices, that's where I start.
All right, that was Matt Rechin, Chief Commercial Officer at ReadySet, and Geoff Gates, Senior Director of Supply Chain Support Services, P2P, and Technology at Cleveland Clinic, talking about best practices not only for supply chain, but for the clinical teams, operationally, which includes supply chain and the clinical teams, obviously, but also getting that vendor alignment. And I thought Matt did a really nice job of kind of pulling in best practices that vendors can keep in mind in terms of how they can come really proactive to a healthcare organization with ideas and opportunities to really continue to provide more and more value to their organizations. And of course, Geoff and the clinic really do a phenomenal job of taking that strategic approach. And then finally, I'll just kind of say I love the idea of alignment meetings instead of what kind of seems routine and mundane in some ways over the years of just doing a QBR. And I know that plenty of people approach those QBRs strategically, but I think even just kind of changing the purpose, which is alignment, and everything that we talked about on the podcast today with Matt and Geoff. So thank you all very much for listening to this episode of the ReadySet podcast on power supply.